In computer science, and more generally when programming and coding, you might have heard of variables. In this video, we'll take a look at some types of variables and how they work, including a few examples in Scratch along the way. There are a few different types of variables that we're going to touch on today. This isn't an exhaustive list, but it will cover some of the most common types of variables that we could use with Scratch. The types we'll cover are booleans, integers, floats, strings, and lists. There will be timestamps in the comments if you want to navigate between these. By the end of this video, you'll be able to explain how all of these variable types are used, and even use them while programming your own apps and games. The term variable in programming and computer science is a little bit different to how it's used in math. In math, a variable can represent any number, but in coding and computer science, a variable isn't just limited to numbers. They can hold all sorts of data. A good way to think of a variable is like a box that can contain different data. There can be many versions of the same box, so to tell them apart we give each of them a name. We can also change the data that's in each box using our code. Each type of variable holds a different form of data and requires a different type of box. For instance, string data just won't fit into a boolean box, and vice versa. But this doesn't mean that they can't influence each other through some clever code. The important thing to remember is that what's contained in each box or variable can be changed by using the code and referred to later when we need it. In essence, a variable is a way to just store data for use later on. Let's take a look at some of these different types of variables. Booleans are data that are either true or false. Going back to our analogy, a boolean variable is a box that can only hold the information true or false. This can look like a checkbox that's either empty or ticked, the words true or false, or even a 1 or 0. Let's take a look at how these work in Scratch. In Scratch, when we're using booleans, we don't get to see the actual true or false statements. What we see are these little hexagonal blocks. These are our boolean blocks. Each of these is either true or false. So if we look at the key space pressed, if the key space is pressed, then it's true. If not, then it's false. And this is the output that it gives to our code. We use these if else, wait until, and repeat until blocks to help us control how we use our booleans. For more information on how we use these, check out our boolean video. The word integer is one we get from mathematics, which means a whole number. An integer can be any positive or negative number, including 0, but it can't be fractional or decimal. Going back to our boxes, an integer box only holds these whole numbers. With integers, we can use our code to do math, like adding or multiplying, making this a good data type for holding our scores, for example. To see some integers in action, check out our videos in Scratch by clicking the eye icon above. A float is like an integer, but a float can hold fractional or decimal values as well as whole numbers. This means a float box can hold any number, much like a variable in math. Like integers, floats can be used to do math, but with the ability to use decimal places, they can be used for more precise roles. This makes floats useful for tasks like recording the position of sprites on the screen. In Scratch, integers and floats are handled in the same way. Let's quickly look at how that works. In Scratch, to get to variables, we scroll down through the list of all the blocks, or we can click on the variables option on the side list here. This takes us under the variables heading where we can see make a new variable. We can also make a list down the bottom, and you've got 5 blocks here about variables. They relate to, at the moment, this variable called myVariable, which I'm going to right click and rename to test. Right, this is my test variable. I can make a new variable by clicking up here. I can give it a name. You want to give it a name that makes sense for what it is. So if it's speed of an object, you give it speed, or if it's score, you call it score. You can decide if that's for all sprites or just for that sprite only, whichever sprite you've created it in. And then you can also decide if you want it to be a cloud variable. This is only available to people that are Scratchers, and if you want to learn more about that, check out our video on that topic. Alright, we'll just close this off for now. Under test, we've got now a score of 0, and if I click this little box here, you can see test pops up over on this side. Up here, if I right click, I've got these options. I can use the normal layout, the large readout, or the slider readout. Now slider goes up in whole numbers, But right now we're going to leave it at 0 and go back to our normal layout there. On the left hand side here, we'll go again, we've got the set test to whichever value we want, so I could set that to 100. And if I click that, test is now at 100, that's what it's worth. I can also use this block here to change it by a smaller increment. So instead of setting it to a certain amount, I can just add to it, right? And I can add to it positively by adding 1 each time. I can make that a -1, and I can take 1 away every time. Or I can also change this to a decimal, so 0. Let's say 2 for instance. I can add 0.2 to it until we're back at 100. Every time you do this, you can tell that you're changing this variable up here. But if you've got it hidden away, you can also see that it's able to be hidden and shown using your code. So using these blocks here, we can either show variable or we can hide the variable. And you might want to do this if you're doing something like a score that you only want to pop up for so long every time the score updates, for instance. This is basically the full control set for our variables, and as you can see, because we're using numbers and because we're using a decimal number, we're using floats here. If you want to use an integer type variable, you can basically just leave it at 1. So as long as you don't reference a decimal, it'll be equivalent to being an integer. You can also use blocks down here in the operators to do some simple math. So you can check if things are greater than or less than with our booleans, and you can also do the math operations here. And you can use our variable circle here to add to that and help it make more complex problems that you can solve. So that's basically float variables in Scratch. String is the name we give to variables that contain text. This includes letters, numbers, and special characters. A string box will hold any text that you can enter, but if you put a number into a string box, it can no longer be used for math, unless you turn it back into an integer or float by using some code. We use strings to hold names, sentences, and just about any other form of text that you can think of. Let's take a quick look. Much like when we were looking at our floats before, if we look at string variables in Scratch, we're using the exact same blocks. So under set test2, I'm going to change this from 0, which it is at the moment, to hello world. If I click on this now, hello world comes up in my test variable. This is what the variable is holding now. It's holding this string that says hello world. I can change it again by, let's get rid of world and just say hello. Now my variable's changed to hello. Unfortunately, we can't do math to it because Scratch handles all strings as though they've got the value of 0, which means that we can't do any math there and add things on to the end of our hello. We can't do hello plus 1, but that's something to consider and just remember while we're using our code. We use strings in variables for things where we want to record text, and often this is, say, recording someone's username or their name when we ask them what their name is in Scratch. So we can record that as their high score, or so that we can talk back to them using like a chatbot. So that's basically strings in Scratch. During this video, we've taken a good look at variables and how they work. We've also taken a closer look at a few different types of variables and used them in some simple examples. If you don't feel like you've quite got it, feel free to go back and watch some parts of the video again. When you feel comfortable with all of this knowledge, you'll be ready to use some variables in your own programming.